Good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Orisa Lutsevich. I am the head of Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. And thank you very much for joining our event today to discuss the defenses of Kyiv. Obviously, there has been a lot of attention of this war in the southeast of Ukraine, especially Mariupol, Melitopol, Kharkiv, the atrocious bombing that is taking place, including of a civilian infrastructure, buildings. There has been more than 900 missiles that have already been launched into Ukraine from both Russian territory, Black Sea, and Belarus. But today we want to discuss, obviously, the core of Ukraine, the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. These early days, we've already seen shelling of two regions in Kyiv. One is Podil. For many of you who has been to Ukraine can perfectly imagine how Podil looks, and also Kharkiv, which is on the left bank of Kyiv. But obviously, we do know from Russia's declared, at least, objectives of that military campaign is to take control over Kyiv, is to incapacitate Ukrainian top military and political leadership, install some kind of a puppet regime, and basically make Ukraine capitulate on the terms that President Putin has in mind. So I have an excellent panelist today, Andriy Levus, who is the heading now resistance movement Free Ukraine. Andriy is tuning in exactly from Kyiv, where he is leading the civic resistance jointly with the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Andriy is an experienced activist. He was also a member of parliament after the Euromaidan. He was briefly working at the Ukrainian security services. In the parliament, he was heading the subcommittee on national security. And today he stands with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian volunteers on the front lines to defend Kyiv. Andriy will be speaking in Ukrainian. So those of you who need interpretation, please go over to the little globe and select the language. We will be helped by Irina Inozemtseva, who is working a lot with us to help Ukraine voices understand globally. And I will not take more of your time and go directly to Andriy, who will give us an overview of what are the Russian military objectives, how are they trying to achieve tactically such objectives, how Ukraine is trying to defend its capital. Andriy, передаю вам слово.
Дякую вам.
Thank you, Risa. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to such a wonderful and interested audience. I understand, to me, Chatham House has always been at a very high level of political expertise, and I've never thought that I will have an occasion to talk to you during the war. The entire situation seems surrealistic to me. Yesterday, I was in the Brovary district, and there is hostility underway there. And today, I have this opportunity to talk to people from London and all throughout the world. Over the last few days, we've survived a lot of things, and I hope that I can share that with you. As far as the military and political aims of the Russian Federation are concerned, they've never hidden their attitude to Ukraine. In 2014, that was the brightest manifestation of this attitude. And it remains enigmatic to me, because from the very beginning of the existence of Ukrainian independent state, just the democratic government that existed before, or quasi-democratic government that existed before President Putin was elected to this post, he actually kept silent. But ever since he took that post, that position, he's always declared that Ukraine is a failed state, that it is a geopolitical mistake of the humanity. So his aim is to destroy Ukraine as a state, as a subject in the international relations. And I think that you've analyzed that many times already. And that might be kind of a truism that you've heard from Ukrainian and international experts. I'll tell you what the situation is like on the ground. We are now living through an act of military aggression. In addition, we observe several unusual forms of this warfare. 80% of this war is in the information space. It's information warfare, and 20% are about hot hostilities or active hostilities. Now, speaking about Kyiv, it is indeed a target for Moscow. They are planning to encircle the city. I don't know if you can see the map behind me. Here is the west, east, and north, and we've got Russian troops everywhere. And the only way out of the city is south and southwest of the city itself. We are not yet encircled, but there is a plan to encircle Kyiv and to lay a siege. And they plan to continue putting pressure to bear on the Ukrainian government, political, informational, and military. And they are using heavy artillery, shelling the city. And the main intrigue today is how long will we be able to keep Russian artillery away from the city center? The closer they approach to the city line, the closer they get to our residential area, the more vulnerable we are. And it will mean that they will be targeting not only those residential areas at the outskirts, but also Maidan and the governmental headquarters, and the place where I am currently in a kilometer away from Saint Sophia Cathedral. So once they approach the city line, once they locate their artillery systems there, the time will speed up. The time might come up for them to destroy the capital city as they did in Volnovakha, Mariupol, and Kharkiv. They razed those cities and towns to the ground. So it is our task not to let it happen. And they are now trying to encircle cities so that they could cut off the population from essential supplies like foodstuffs, medicines, all the very important necessities, as well as military supplies. And thus, we won't have any support from the outside. A lot of volunteers rush to the capital city to be part of the territorial defense units. And once they encircle, if they encircle the capital city, they would put forward their demands of our capitulation or of some unacceptable concession. So if a capital city falls, it means that the entire country falls or capitulates. So Moscow wants to undermine the entire system of power in the system, or to hijack them, all of the governmental institutions, so that they are crippled. For example, if there is a problem with parliament, it will mean that we won't be able to adopt the necessary legislation. The same pertains to the cabinet of ministers and other public agencies. So they will be also targeting those institutions, their premises, with artillery or missiles. And they are not targeting those premises right now because they do want our parliament to be able to assemble and actually accept or agree to capitulation. So they might demand something related to a demilitarization, quote unquote, or quote unquote denationalization, etc. So it is our task to push them back as far as possible from the city lines. And it has been our task since the first day of the war. I can tell you that a month before the war, we met in the Brovary town. It is a small Sputnik town or satellite town of the city. We went there to form the first voluntary battalion of the territorial communities there. It was just the first manifestation of the so-called territorial defense unit, when the community members self-organized and with the support of the local authorities, trained to resist the aggressor. So that's an interesting fact that can show you the public sentiment on the eve of that war. And there's a field commander called Yezhako the Hedgehog, and he is a member of the Territorial Defense Force. We've been friends with him since Maidan, since 2014. And we went to the HQ of Special Operation Forces, and we saw that powers that be at that time were fairly skeptical about the opportunity or about the chances for Putin to launch this aggression. Just they told us we were paranoid. And when we heard those responses, it was the exact time when the first missile hit the training ground of the Territorial Defense Force. And it's thanks to the volunteers, to local community members who collected all of their forces and started to put up resistance to the enemy. Particularly, the first days were totally critical. You might not know that they were trying to break our resistance and our defenses close to Vyshgorod at a dam. And they targeted Vyshgorod, and there were actually subversive reconnaissance groups infiltrating into the city, and we had to fight them on the ground in the city. Over these 20 days, the Ukrainian system of defense and security has collected itself, and our armed forces are holding their strikes and their attacks, but the attacks are so severe that it is ever more difficult to do so. And if you look at the projectiles, missiles, and rockets that they are using, they would be hitting the capital city from time to time. It's not the massive shelling or bombing. What's the purpose? Yesterday, for example, they hit the Podil district that you mentioned, Larissa, and today they hit a neighborhood close to the very center of the city, and it damaged the metro station. And you will know that metro stations, underground premises of the metro stations are being used as bomb shelters. And when people rush there to hide from the potential airstrike, they hit the entrance into the metro station. So the enemy is advancing slowly but steadily. in spite of all our attempts to hold them back. So they use massive bombing and shelling of residential areas with no doubts at all. So of course, we could have located our artillery inside the city and start returning that fire, but that will jeopardize our local population. And if you recall this special operation in 2014, when they annexed the Crimea, they said that we will be behind women and children and try to hit us. So close to the villages that have been occupied by now, they are cut off in terms of logistics. But imagine they locate their artillery guns there. In one of the villages, they located 40 Grad systems in the center of the village, and they were shooting from there. So they are provoking us. They take people hostages. They shoot people for nothing, just out of spite, for entertainment. They grab cell phones from civilians if they see that a person is just intending to make a call. And they shoot those people as well. In some of the cut-off villages, of the occupied villages, people have no supplies whatsoever. So they starve, and where fires occur and our emergency services would go there, they would not be let enter those villages. And there would be the need to start to evacuate people, including babies, from those fires and shoot back at the enemy. So that's what Ukraine and Kyiv look like today. So rescuers are at the same time soldiers. So they would be rescuing people from fire and shooting back at the enemy to make sure that those rescued people are safe. So our resistance movement is not only about Molotov cocktails or shooting back. It's about also winning in the information warfare, raising awareness and projecting a positive image of Ukraine. So we monitor the media, and when I see this hashtag in social media, "Stop Hating Russians," it hurts me, because Russian agents and spies in the West are trying to impose a narrative in your countries that it was Ukraine that threatened the Russian Federation. And that, for example, yesterday, Ukrainian Armed Forces fired a missile towards Donetsk. That's not true. So we've got a lot of discussions, and we can see that there are attempts to force Ukraine to make concessions. Is it normal, do you think, that a person who is attacked, for example, by a murderer who intends to kill this person, defends him or herself, and then the people observing that would say, you should sit down and agree with that attacker. You should make concessions. Why should we make our constitution different? Why should we make concessions? We were attacked, and whatever they do is beyond moral, beyond human, or humane for that matter. So I wouldn't be making any comparisons here, but I believe that not a single totalitarian regime of the past in Europe or elsewhere behaved like the Russian invaders behave today. So there is no point for negotiations. We can't be a neutral country as long as the Russian Federation exists within its current borders. And with this model of governance, every Ukrainian would always be in jeopardy. So their siloviki, their law enforcement.
Wrap up, тому що є багато питань. Just wrap up your thought. Закінчіть цю думку, і ми тоді перейдемо до питань.
Sorry about that. Sure, I've taken too much of your time. Just my last thought to be shared with you. Now we expect that the West would not be urging us to negotiate concessions with the Russian Federation and sign something that would be detrimental to our country. So for you to understand that any agreement signed with Russia would not live one day because they would violate it. They would not abide by it. And we want your support and we need your support. For example, our movement needs your support because there are many manifestations of this aggression. And there are certain administrative issues. We need supplies of equipment, both for city battles inside the cities and personal protective gears. All of that is needed.
You've made several very important points that we all should pay attention to. One is obviously this urge for justice, and something that is very prominent in Ukrainian society, that this aggression is completely unjustified, and there will be a strong resistance no matter what happens to the political leadership. And something that a lot of people must understand, that Ukraine is very much a horizontal society, not a top-down society, and will be able, regardless of what happens to the leadership, reorient itself and organize to ensure this resistance continues. And we had an interesting event in Chatham House launching a declaration on the International Tribunal for the Crimes Against Peace that will actually try to deliver the justice for war crimes that Putin and his army is performing in Ukraine. But I want to come back more to a military support, because that's one of the pillars to make sure Ukraine can stand. And I know that my colleague Mathieu Bouleg would like to come in. He is the one who is monitoring a lot security and defense situation. He probably has a comment and then a question. Anya, if you can unmute Mathieu, and then I'll go through some of the questions in the comments. Mathieu.
Thank you very much, Orysia, and thank you very much, Andrei, for the opening comment. I just have to insist on a few points that you made, but just to reiterate the importance of preventing this battle for Kyiv for all the right reasons to support Ukraine and all the wrong reasons to stop the Kremlin. It's an information campaign, of course, and this is even more so. It's a terror campaign. We've seen the indiscriminate bombing across different city centers. This cannot happen in Kyiv because of the density of population. We've seen instrumentalization by Russia of humanitarian corridors in other urban centers, particularly gruesome in Kharkiv and in Mariupol. This, once again, cannot happen in Kyiv because of the density of population. If you look at a more tactical operational point of view, advances are very slow because of the way Russia is approaching urban warfare. They try to avoid having to fight sort of hand on hand, but using these terror campaigns and these shellings at the moment, ground shellings and ground indiscriminate bombardments, because their precision is not really good. Even the precision guided munitions that Russia has been shooting since the start of the war are not extremely precise and leave a wide margin of error, which means that the more margin of error you have, the more civilians will die because bombs don't fall exactly where they should. The other problem for Russia is that tactical aviation, which is bombarding from the sky, is not ideal because Ukrainian air defense systems are still standing. It was an assumption that the Kremlin would be able to suppress air defense of Ukraine very quickly. They failed, thank God, in a way. So it is even more paramount now to provide Ukraine with the necessary ammunition so that they can actually keep shooting at everything that Russia sends from the skies. No air defense and no air support for Ukraine means that Russia will be able to advance quicker against Kyiv. And if Kyiv keeps its air defense and air support, this will allow for more flexibility to bring necessary aid, necessary assistance for the citizens of Ukraine fighting this war and surviving in a state of siege. So I can only stress the importance of providing an increasing military assistance from the West in assistance to Ukraine. Then in terms of pure combat and in terms of pure urban warfare, then geography does not play in Russia's favor, thank God as well. Russian forces can only take Kyiv from the east and the west because of the river, which limits the approaches from the north and the south. And also because a lot of adjacent fields from the north and the south have been actually flooded preemptively to limit the advances of Russian ground forces. So very smart and quick move from Ukraine here to try to slow down the advances. Also, the problem is that political institutions and most of the city center, if you've been to Kyiv, are actually on the heights. So it's not really efficient when you play offense to try to attack from a lower position and to try to reach the heights. And also because for the past 2.5 weeks now, Ukrainians and defense forces more particularly have been reinforcing the approaches, have been closing off bridges, have been closing off avenues of advance and access of advance for Russia, which means that if there is genuine urban warfare, this will be a terrible battle. The Chechen forces, for instance, have been deployed in Ukraine, and we all know what they do. They do mop up urban operations with absolutely no regard for human life, which means that once again, this battle for Kyiv should not happen. It must not happen. The last problem that I see is that if Kyiv is not taken quickly by Russian forces, how could it? Then it leads to increased frustration and extreme risk-taking by the Kremlin itself. And we've all seen the false flag operation last week with against Belarus, where it is still not improbable, although not quite possible, that Russia would want to bring troops from Belarus to storm Kyiv, or as Russia does not have or cannot commit enough force to take over the city, would bring in some troops from Belarus with a standing army of about 60,000. And the last point, and this is the worst point, is discussions regarding the use of chemical weapons. Andrei mentioned it, the information warfare campaign is already here. Russia has been using information warfare to sort of mobilize awareness that Ukraine is developing chemical weapons that, of course, because everybody knows that, and that they would use it indiscriminately against Russian forces. So they're already preparing the ground for justifying the use of chemical weapons as a preemptive strike against Ukraine. If we can think about it, the Kremlin has a plan for it, and we must prevent it from happening in the first place. These are extremely dangerous weapons. The other problem is that we all know what they mean in terms of the red line. They were already used in Syria. It did not bring enough attention in the West, and President Obama sort of compromised on the red line as well in Syria. This should not happen in Ukraine again. So I will stop here.
Well, thanks very much, Mateo, for bringing in especially Belarus, angle of Belarus, what is happening from the north, because that is also a key factor where Russians are trying to internationalize this war, if you want, by engaging other states that they de facto control Belarus. But maybe Andrei can give us the latest on what kind of moves they see from the north when they monitor, or whatever intelligence you have that you can share with us. And also, Andrei, there were a lot of questions in the chat specifically for military assistance to civilian resistance, to the movement of this territorial defense units. Are you receiving necessary supply? are there serious bottlenecks, obviously without revealing too much, because we do know that it's all sensitive information, but what it is that is, you know, working relatively well, and where are the gaps that you see in supply? And perhaps you can also explain to the audience how these defense units, territorial defense units, are integrated with Ukrainian armed forces, so that people understand the outlook, how you are cooperating together, and at which levels. Андрій, вам слово.
Yes, I'll start with our interoperability with the armed forces and with the structures that we've got in place, because the Russian propaganda paints a picture of some disorganized Banderivites who actually do not have the regular structures, and that's why we have to denazify Ukraine. But indeed, we have a very strong structure here, and even this civilian resistance is not spontaneous. And even where the tanks would approach a village, then the people will self-organize and put it on fire. But this civilian resistance allows us a new opportunity. We've got territorial defense, as you know already. These are militarized units formed out of local residents, prepared to defend their communities. There are also voluntary units within territorial communities. They are not very well organized or directly subordinated to the military forces of Ukraine, but they are armed with small arms, and they come together to protect their own apartments, houses, their communities, and to prevent looting. Right? And when we speak about the resistance movement, our movement, it's a notion that emerged quite recently, and according to the constitution, every Ukrainian is entitled to defend his or her country in various capacities, fighting in the international warfare or participating in hostilities. And we act in accordance with Ukrainian legislation. And the commanders of such voluntary units as ours, we've got several such in Kyiv. Then there would be a commander of the territorial defense forces who appoints smaller commanders or supervisors in smaller units. And veterans of this war, since 2014, a lot of such commanders were trained. And we, for example, our unit brings together experts who know a lot about guerrilla warfare. We were trained and we were participating in the war in the East since 2014. These are counter-saboteur groups, etc. Then the urban warfare, urban battle experts as well, because sooner or later we will have to fight on the ground inside the city line. And there are people who are well trained to do so, not because we are trigger happy, but because we understand the need to protect our country. And we work with counterintelligence services and with special operation forces, with local military administrations in different cities. So we are interoperational. There are certain bottlenecks, of course, when it comes to supplies, particularly with delivering supplies to the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine. There are lots of checkpoints and the movement is slowed down because of that. As there was also a question about the encircling of the city. Right now, the Russian troops haven't got the capacity to encircle the city. For one thing, it is a very large city. For another, they haven't got either manpower or material to do so. And the relief, as Matthew said, actually prevents them from doing that, but they can hire the route for supplies. And we often observe saboteur and reconnaissance groups, and now we are monitoring how they are moving their reserves to be prepared for that. So now we are not speaking about individual groups of saboteurs, but whole units of those. And I would like to underscore yet again that we do need equipment for guerrilla warfare, because we have cities and towns and even the entire oblast, Kherson Oblast, temporarily occupied by the Russians, and they were taken totally unprepared, caught unprepared. And they are now moving, actually, their security forces trying to concoct a sham referendum, and they now being it is they are trying to convince people that Kherson Oblast is a Russian Federation. But here in Kyiv, you can see what's going on in the rear. Those attacks against critical infrastructure facilities, but we also are very actively hitting them in their rear. We destroy their logistic chains, and we can provide footage of very interesting attacks, or counterattacks rather, by our forces. I wouldn't go into too much of detail and prompt it to Russians how to counteract our smaller attacks. So what we need is anti-tank missiles, and when it comes to connections before every wave of an attack or an onslaught, they are bringing closer the electronic warfare means. So the issue of connectivity has been addressed to a certain way in or extent by the regular armed forces, and they keep the front line. But we, I mean the territorial defense, not us, but our comrades in arms who are active in the enemy's rear, they've got problems with cell coverage and with connectivity with communications. And they actually deactivate every coverage, and we cannot connect with our comrades there. And we are concerned about their security and safety, of course. So whatever can be done to help us to do counter sabotage activities and guerrilla warfare and resistance in the enemy's rear. That would be very useful, because it is about high-tech things. And I know that a line of expenditure should be deblocked for Ukraine to receive such such pieces of equipment. These gadgets, these technologies or pieces of equipment are not expensive, they are not bulky, so they can be transported and delivered fairly fast, but they are most needed.
I think it's very important when you were in your presentation mentioning the siege, the almost medieval siege of the cities that they are now, the Russia deploys against Ukraine, but there's also information siege in those territories that they occupy and partially occupy, because they cannot even establish full control, but they are deploying a quite savage tactic of kidnapping the mayors, of kidnapping the organizers of resistance. This is something they have been doing in the annexed Crimea, and we know that this is a continuation of the practice, where the Rosgvardia, right, the Russian internal security services are being deployed exactly to single out those individuals who organize and mobilize resistance to Russian occupying force. And indeed, there's quite a lot of emphasis on short range VHF radios that Ukrainian resistance movement needs to mount basically the counterinsurgency inside those occupied territories. But something very important to understand the risks for those people. Obviously, it's not. It's a very brutal tactic. So, Andriy, there's a question on Russia specifically. You mentioned. Yeah, you want to add something? Go ahead.
Here, just a brief note. If I could reformulate it. So the equipment for this kind of fight, or this kind of warfare, is transferred to specialized units. But I call on international forces, community, and the governments to provide equipment to territorial defense force in general, because the guerrilla warfare will rely on territorial defense. The territorial defense units would be the core of this guerrilla warfare if the territories are occupied. And we have got here the most active people, starting from IT specialists to rock stars and politicians. And of course, we need training, certain instructions, if you wish, on how to use this equipment, high-tech equipment, particularly for the members of territorial defense, not only the specialized units of the armed forces.
Amendments to what some people may think in terms of military assistance. But there are two questions on Russia. One is specifically from George Buliga, who is asking, don't you think that if Putin bombs and destroys Kyiv, he will never be able to explain it to his fellow Russians? Wouldn't his entire historical narrative of the Kievan origin of Russia be demolished that way? Would that historical fallacy, in the way we understand it, deter Putin from brutal tactics of hitting in the heart of Kyiv, you know, all these sacred places, the way Russia was always portraying it? Do you think that's something that will restrain Putin, or not really?
I think he doesn't care a damn about what happens to Kyiv, and he doesn't care whether Kyiv survives or not. You will know that several people surrendered, several soldiers or officers of the Russian armed forces were captured, and they tell us, when we interview them, they said that you shelled the maternity clinic. It wasn't us, it was you. So their picture of the world is so distorted that Russians, regular citizens, will believe that the Ukrainian armed forces themselves undermine Saint Sophia Cathedral.
And another one on Russia from Dick Rogers, who says, if you, meaning Kyiv, Ukraine, hold on long enough, the Russians may collapse from inside. Yes or no?
The only way to make sure that Ukraine survives and the free world survives, because it is a war against the civilized world, would be to disassemble this construction called the Russian Federation. You should remember that there are hundreds of ethnic groups that are suppressed by the Russians, by the Russian government, and we can see certain resistance movement just being brewed inside Russia. Just during the Maidan, when the Heavenly 100 were killed, we set up a special committee for the criminal prosecution of Putin. And with us are also representatives of the Kyiv government, the Free Ichkeria Republic, and representatives of other indigenous peoples that would be prepared to fight against Putin. And according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these indigenous people should have their rights, but in the Russia of today, they are being repressed, suppressed, and annihilated. So I believe that Kyiv will prevail, and we historical Rus gave rise to this monster. Of course, it's a topic of a different discussion, but we understand that they want to exterminate us. And it's not only about Putin, it's not only about the president. For example, if he disappears tomorrow, there would be Putin 0.2. So we have to liberate the oppressed indigenous people of the Russian Federation, and they understand that while Ukraine and Kyiv exist, their lies about one nation or about who is the older brother and who is the younger one will be an open question. So they want to destroy the original so that the copy would prevail and would pose as the original. So Putin is now waging a defensive rather than offensive war, because he is defending his lies about historical ties between Russia and Ukraine, historic, mental, ethnical, etc. do not work. So we are exporting dignity and democracy and our values to them, and he is afraid. So he caught us by the say heel with those so-called LNR and DNR, and he thought that he would be keeping us in captivity for always, but that didn't happen, and today he is afraid of us. And I think that it is a historic mission that we will perform. Please understand that what drives him is fear of civilized world. There's a very good British movie about the revolver. Remember, there is a moment when you are being hunted, then you can turn from the hunted into the hunter. But we need your support with that.
Pointed something important that is, I see, increasingly being understood also in the West, that Ukrainians have proven that Russian armed forces is not as invincible or not as successful as they have been portrayed, even after all the modernization of army. Clearly, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that they've demonstrated fighting a much weaker military force in Ukraine. But something that you've talked about, fear. I think also millions of Ukrainians have shed that feeling of fear of Putin, and also the complex of inferiority that Russia wanted to impose on Ukraine, living all the time in the shadow of the empire. Now, many Ukrainians feel very empowered, very proud of Ukrainian Armed Forces, which they were proud already before this war. 70% of Ukrainians trusted Ukrainian Armed Forces. It was the largest trust institution in Ukraine out of all state institutions. But maybe if we have a couple of minutes left, if you say a little bit about, from observing Russian military on the ground, how is their morale looking? Because there's a question from Trish de Borgraf, for example, whether it may be hard to generalize Russian fighter morale, but do you have any evidence of their discontent or indeed their greater resolve? Like you said, maybe they'll go there to defend the Orthodox world. Is there any information on that? And maybe to wrap up, also more tactical strengths and vulnerabilities where you see of Russian armed forces as they try to take Kyiv in a circle of siege. So a bit of morale and more on tactical strengths and vulnerabilities.
Так, ну дивіться, з початку агресії, коли тільки вона почалась, так?
Now, when the aggression was launched, we were totally stunned with their tactics, because they were moving in convoys, and our Bayraktar UAVs and our artillery kept hitting them, but they never regrouped. But when we spoke with the POWs or the captives, we ascertained that, for one thing, their equipment was not prepared to move along the pit bogs, for example, and they could only move along highways. We should thank perhaps President Zelensky for his great construction project that they could move along those recently repaired roads. And besides, they told us that they were told in turn that they were going to participate in the training in military exercises in Belarus, and their cell phones were taken away from them. And when they crossed the border, they thought that they would be welcome here by local citizens. But now, and they are brainwashed with their propaganda, and they were shocked when they were captured, that they were treated in a very civilized way, that they were let call their relatives in the Russian Federation, that they were provided with medical assistance when needed, and that they were even provided with legal aid when needed. So they thought that there were civilized people living in Ukraine. And I think that it's not only Putin or 30 oligarchs that have been hunted right now so far, but all of the Russians, they should be afraid of us. And until they still have some money from their welfare fund and the money to buy vodka and watch television, they would continue to stand their turn to die in Ukraine. And there are some very worrisome signs, and we have been in communication with this fund of soldiers' mothers of Ukraine, right? And what worries us is that if soldiers who have been captured here in Ukraine are then released and allowed to go back, they would never reach their homes. They would be killed by their own retreat retreat blocking detachment. So I do not want to humiliate any nation or any representatives of any country, but they've been victims of totalitarianism for a very long time. They consume this propaganda and they do not see the real world. And we have to break this distorted picture of theirs. They haven't got the vivid civil society, and you can see it with the rallies that they try to organize against war in the Russian Federation. Say 5,000 people, we've got millions in the streets when we understand that there's a threat to democracy and to our rights. It is yet for them to understand that they've been robbed of their own destiny, of their own future, and of that of their children. And it doesn't matter how many yachts you will seize from Russian oligarchs. They are not in Russia right now. But it matters when an Ivan from Kaluga understands that he has lived his entire life in lies. These are tough things to say, but we have the right to say so because they killed thousands of civilians, say in Mariupol, totally innocent people.
Well, we'll follow closely because there is supposed to be the new round of sanctions announced also today in the UK, and a couple of names you mentioned, like these Russian propagandists that are poisoning actually Russian brains. They hopefully will be also on the list. But I think more broadly what you are saying is that Putin's social contract, if we can say, with Russian citizens was that, you know, they are getting richer and that Putin can stay in power forever. That social contract is now broken. Russians will get only poorer from now. The question is how they will rebel, when, and how the elites will or not join in that rebellion. I think it's also, that's why it's so important that every day Ukraine stands, every day you stand in Kyiv and in other large Ukrainian cities. That makes Russia, that makes a chance for this scenario more likely, more probable. But that also, from what we hear from you, requires a very close cooperation between Ukraine and its Western allies to work towards this geostrategic objective, something that you talk about, that it's not just one man's war, it's a Putinism as an ideology that is actually undermining European security and preventing from having Europe whole and free from happening. So look, I would like to thank you very much for taking time. We hope we also give you a little bit of respite from the battlefields to have a conversation with us. I know it's very intense for you and your comrades. I would like to thank Irina Inozemtseva, who was our interpreter today, that made this also conversation possible. We wish you all the best. Stay strong, and let's stay in contact. Whatever information we would like to share with us, we are here. And stay well and protect Kyiv.
Дякую вам. Слава Україні.
Героям слава. Stay well.